Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you about is what I told you I would talk about, which is where cases that exist where Mendelian genetics is certainly useful, perhaps an oversimplification, and maybe even dangerous. And first, let me talk about the concept of it being useful. Obviously, when we think about Mendelian genetics in terms of using it to figure out how things are inherited, it makes a lot of sense and it allows us to be able to predict things with a reasonable amount of certainty. It's still probability, of course, but it certainly it's a good idea to use it when you're trying to make broad assumptions about inheritance. Okay? And for that, let's say we take something as simple as attached earlobes versus not attached earlobes. So let me show you a picture of what I mean by that. Okay, here you have a picture of what I'm talking about here. You'll notice here that for folks who have the attached earlobe, there's no little sort of space that exists between the skull and the bottom of the ear. Whereas you can see here, you have a little bit of a pocket that can develop there, so it hangs down. And actually, I don't know if there's any published studies that say that this is the case, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. I'm not sure how this is collected, that this is a simple dominant recessive situation. And that is that unattached earlobes is dominant to attached earlobes, and it's a single gene or a single allele that determines that. So I suppose if we're talking about earlobes, it's very useful to use Mendelian genetics to figure out whether or not your children will inherit your attached or unattached earlobes, if you consider that sort of thing to be useful. The problem comes when you start using Mendelian genetics and thinking that you can apply it to any characteristic that exists in let's just in this case say a human being, because that's the thing that you guys are all most interested in. So let me hop over to this and let's take a look at something else. What I have here is a classic example of where Mendelian genetics is way too simple to try to predict a particular characteristic. In this case, that characteristic is height. And you'll notice here that this is an interesting photo of all the different nations and their, I think it's their sort of military personnel. And the reason why this is kind of cool is if you take a look at the heights of all these folks who were clearly put in this order on purpose, you can see that there's great variation with regard to height, and yet they're all human beings. Now, if Mendelian genetics were indeed simple inheritance, where you either inherited a gene that would make you tall or short, then it would be a simple matter of imagining that there'd be a whole bunch of people who are all the same height, all say 6 feet tall, and then a whole group of men who were all 5 feet 6 or something like that. And yet, obviously, we don't see that, and it's very clear for all of us to fathom, right, that there's variation that exists in the population for height. And that means, clearly, there's more than one single gene that's responsible for determining how tall you are. And that's, in fact, one of the most overriding issues with Mendelian genetics is that it's very rare, in fact, where a single gene is going to code for a particular trait. More often than not, it's multiple genes interacting with one another to determine a particular trait. In this case, that trait would be height. Okay? So there's an obvious one. Maybe a not so obvious sort of non-oversimplification of Mendelian genetics is eye color. And the reason why I bring up eye color is that we often, when we're introducing Mendelian genetics, talk about the concept of blue eye versus brown eye. And that we always say, well, capital B is brown, and that's dominant, to the lowercase b, which is blue. And in order to have blue eyes, you have to have double recessive lowercase b's in order to show that. Well, time and again, and in fact, even in my family, not my immediate family, but my sister's daughter has greenish blue eyes. And keep in mind that my sister and myself, for that matter, come from a long line of very brown-eyed people. So frankly, the likelihood of us being carriers for the blue eye gene is ridiculously low, if not truly impossible. So it's very likely that my sister was a big B, in which case her daughter should have inherited the brown gene and her eyes should be brown, and yet, boom, they're not. And in fact, if we take a look at this, let me add this little graphic here. This is pretty cool. This is showing, let me erase actually all this stuff here so it gets out of your way. This is showing the variation of eye color that exists in the population. And this is just a sampling. It's clear that there's probably more than this in terms of the spectrum. But what's very important is you have something like a way up here, a very light green, all the way down to here, which is almost a black iris that exists here. And if there were just a sort of a blue and a brown eye color gene, as I originally explained to you guys that there was, you wouldn't have all these different values in between. You wouldn't have green, you wouldn't have hazel, etc. So it's very clear that there's multiple things going on to determine your eye color, not to mention the fact that my niece has blue eyes and she shouldn't have blue eyes according to Mendelian genetics. But that's, again, where Mendelian genetics is enormously oversimplified because of the inherent need to have multiple genes coding for a particular expression of a particular trait. All right, let's zoom to the next concept, and that is something that I'm sure you've all heard about, which is that idea of nature versus nurture. And basically what this argument is, it goes back to what is it that determines who you are, how you look, and how you behave? Is it your genes or is it your environment? Okay, nature being your genes, nurture being the environment. And let me just tell you right now that it's not one or the other. Both things combine. For example, let's take a look at this Achillea plant here. And you can see here that depending on where the Achillea is found, it's going to have a very different look to it in terms of the height. And keep in mind that all these plants were genetically identical to one another because they were a cutting, and which means that they were cut from the same plant and then planted in these particular areas. So they're all genetic clones, which means that the nature is set for all these different plants. And yet when you take a look at this, if you're at high elevation, you have a very different look from those that are at the lower elevation. Okay, so if you notice here, let me just be sure you understand what's going on here. This plant, these set of 3 plants, were all from the same cutting, meaning they're genetic clones here. And clearly you can see here that at medium elevation we have a very stunted fella, versus at high and low elevation you have fairly tall ones. And then if we go here, you can see here too that we have a similar sort of situation where when you're at lower elevation you are a taller plant, and as you gain elevation you get more stunted. Okay, it's not always the case. You can see here that we have some variability, and it's not always consistent. Right? That this medium elevation seems to be the thing that actually is worse for the plants. But the bottom line is, if these are all genetic clones of one another, then frankly they should grow up to be exactly the same in terms of their phenotype. How tall they are, how they look, number of leaves, color, all those things that you think of when you think of a phenotype. And yet very clearly, because they're in different environments, they don't look like each other. So the nature or the environment has a huge impact and role to play on the expression of particular traits. Okay, let me jump to a new page here and bring up another concept here that's related to environment. Plants are my friends, and so I choose to focus in on plants quite often. This is the hydrangea, and I have one of these in my garden. Mine don't look quite this nice. But you'll notice here that we have, in this hydrangea plant, we go from fairly blue, and then we migrate over to being mostly pink with a little bit of blue put in there as well. And what they've come to find, and this is kind of cool, is that when the hydrangea is in fairly acidic soils, they have blue flowers. Whereas when they're in more basic, or actually really not basic so much as neutral soils towards the basic side, then they tend to be more pink. So clearly, very important thing here that there's one aspect of the environment that controls a very important phenotypic trait of the hydrangea, the flower color that we have going on here. So once again, it's not an argument of nature versus nurture, it's that the two of them are combined. Clearly, you have to have genes that would allow you to make these flowers in the first place, but the color of those flowers will ultimately be determined by the environment. Here's another really cool example of where the environment comes into play, and so you can't rely solely on Mendelian genetics here. Mendelian genetics is going to tell that this Himalayan rabbit can have white fur and dark fur regions on its body. But what one may not realize is that the fur color, the dark fur color, is caused by that area of the rabbit being cooler than the other areas of the rabbit. And that cooler temperature allows for the laying down of more pigment, hence dark fur. And this was determined through experimentation, which is really kind of cool. So let's scooch down here. I'm going to add in another photo, and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Here's a photo showing an experiment that was done for these poor little Himalayan rabbits. And you can see that the dude here in the middle, this is just showing it in its natural environment, maybe next to a hydrant, I don't know what that is. But this guy, he had an ice pack that was laid on top of his back. And after a couple of days, they removed the ice pack, and a few days later, he had a very dark brown patch that was on his back. So he went from having no brown patch there, then you cooled that skin just below the area of the fur that was once white, and as a result of cooling that skin, then you had this dark patch. So very clearly, the having the ability to having the environment impact the way you look is shown. It's tantamount here. Okay. Now, how is it that Mendelian genetics? So we now see that Mendelian genetics is an oversimplification for two reasons. One, the impact of environment, and two, the impact of what's called polygeny, where many genes contribute to the expression of a single trait. So where can it be something that's dangerous? Well, I wouldn't say so much dangerous. It's more that you need to be very careful about using Mendelian genetics to drive decision making, because we all know who this is. This is Angelina Jolie. And as you know, Angelina Jolie was about a year, maybe 2 years ago, maybe a year ago, made the very important decision for herself to get a double mastectomy. Okay, double mastectomy. Both of her breasts were removed. And the reason why she made this decision was based on this. And let's see here we go. This is pretty compelling data, which says that if you are somebody who has the mutated BRCA1 gene, you have a more than 50% chance of developing breast cancer by age 70, and sometimes much younger than age 70. All right? And then you could have a mutated BRCA2 gene as well, which then it doesn't double the chances. It doesn't mean that you have a 10 out of 10 chance, but it certainly increases the probability that you're going to have breast cancer, as opposed to somebody who has a normal BRCA gene where you only have 1 in 10, which is still alarmingly high, frankly, which is something that should worry all of us. But obviously, they're getting a chance 1 in 10 versus 6 in 10. There's a big difference there. And as I think, if I'm not mistaken, as it turns out, Angelina Jolie had both the BRCA1 and BRCA2 gene mutations, so there was a much higher probability of her getting breast cancer. Here's the thing, though. Having a probability of getting breast cancer does not mean you are assuredly going to get breast cancer. And, sometimes people react to this information in different ways. Some people may say, well, shoot, yeah, if I have a 60% chance of getting breast cancer, I'm going to make sure I have the surgery to remove my breasts. Well, keep this in mind. That's no light little surgery. That's a significant surgery. And there's dangers in undergoing the knife. So it's not like this should be something where you say, yeah, I'm just going to go and have a double mastectomy this weekend and then think that you can recover in 24 hours. There's always risks of infection, the surgery itself, etc. So when people make decisions based on probabilities, I hope they understand that sometimes the probabilities of developing a particular disease is exceedingly low. And to make a decision based on a probability that is equivalent to you getting hit by lightning may not be such a smart idea, and in fact may be dangerous if you put yourself at risk for other things as a result of undergoing surgery. Okay, so there you have it. We'll stay there with Angelina. I'm going to put let's put a mustache on her face. There you go. I'll see you tomorrow.